the seemingly endless snow stretching across the Siberian wilderness. Towering pines, their branches heavy with frost, framing the landscape. The stillness was broken only by the distant howling of wolves. Nestled deep within this desolation stood a solitary log cabin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, rising into the cold air. The scene was tranquil, almost idyllic, but inside the cabin, chaos reigned. The room was a shrine to obsession. Bookshelves sagged under the weight of mathematical tomes. Parchment covered every surface, equations scrawled in a frenetic hand, trailing off the edges of tables and spilling onto the floor. Diagrams pinned to the walls fluttered as the wind rattled the windows. In the center of it all, a figure sat hunched over a desk. A burly man with wild, unkempt hair and thick glasses. He leaned forward, his pen scratching furiously against the paper. His muttering filled the room, low and rhythmic, like the cabin itself was holding its breath.
"They'll understand it,"
he said, his breath fogging in the frigid air.
"They must. How could they not?"
Around him, massive Siberian bears lounged like family pets. Their sheer size made the cramped room feel even smaller. One leaned against the wall, its dark eyes fixed on the man, while another sprawled by the hearth, its enormous paws twitching as it dreamed. The man finished his latest equation with a flourish, holding it up to the light. A manic grin spread across his face as he leaned back, surveying his work with satisfaction. Reaching for a fresh sheet of parchment, he began to write a letter.
"Dear sirs and madams,"
he began, his voice rising with each sentence.
"I submit to you my most recent innovation, an equation that transcends mere numbers and formulas. It is designed to expand the mind, to reshape perception, and to elevate the human spirit. Through it, your textbooks will become vessels of enlightenment, spreading knowledge in its purest form."
He paused, taking a deep breath.
"It is nothing less than a key to understanding the fabric of reality itself."
Setting down his pen, he leaned back in his chair, addressing the bears as if they were an audience of scholars.
"What do you think, my friends? Will they see the truth?"
The largest bear, sitting majestically by the door, regarded him with a solemn expression. Then, as if in approval, it let out a deep roar that seemed to shake the very walls. The other bears followed suit, their voices filling the cabin with a sound that was both primal and triumphant. The man chuckled, a sound that was equal parts amusement and pride, folding the letter with care and sealing it. Outside, the sound of the bears' roars faded into the Siberian wilderness as the smoke curling from the chimney dissolved into the cold sky. A few months later, nestled in the center of a small English town, stood a modest brick building with the words White Cross Secondary School etched above its arched entrance. The steady ring of a school bell echoed through the halls as students poured into classrooms, their voices blending into a chorus of youthful energy. Inside one classroom, the buzz settled as the teacher stood at the front, her presence commanding. A pristine stack of freshly printed textbooks sat on her desk. The teacher tapped the topmost book with a sense of pride and excitement. "All right, everyone," she began, her tone warm but firm. "Today we're starting something new. This curriculum has been designed to challenge your critical thinking skills and help you approach mathematics in ways you never have before. I expect great things from you all." She moved through the rows, handing out the textbooks one by one. "I think you'll find these fascinating. We'll begin on page 13. Some students eagerly flipped through the pages, eyes lighting up at the promise of new material. Others sighed heavily, already doodling in the margins, resigned to what they considered another tedious math lesson. "Everyone ready?" The teacher moved back to the chalkboard, holding her own copy of the textbook. She opened it to the specified page, her finger trailing down the numbers and symbols printed there. "This," she said, gesturing to the equation displayed on the page, "is what we shall be working on today. It's a bit different, but don't worry. It's meant to be a challenge." The equation spanned the width of the page, its symbols intricate and precise, with a complexity that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. Numbers looped into patterns, forming shapes that felt unsettlingly alive. A few students gasped audibly. "It's like it's moving," one whispered, leaning closer to their book. "That's impossible," another muttered, though their voice lacked conviction. From the front of the room, the teacher smiled encouragingly. I know it looks intimidating, but let's break it down together. Math is all about finding patterns, and I promise you, they're here. She turned to the chalkboard, beginning to transcribe the equation. The screech of the chalk seemed unusually loud, and a strange tension settled over the room. As the students worked through the equation, the air seemed to grow heavier. The lights flickered faintly, and a low hum began to move through the room, barely perceptible but unmistakably present. Miss, something's weird, one student said, their voice breaking the silence. The teacher turned back toward her classroom, perplexed. I feel strange, one of the students quivered. The teacher's brow furrowed. It's just a complex problem, she reassured them, though her own voice carried a hint of unease. Then it began. A faint growl echoed from the far corner of the classroom. Heads snapped around, eyes scanning the room for its source. Did anyone hear that? Someone whispered. Another growl, louder this time, and a shadow flickered across the wall. The teacher froze, her eyes darting toward the sound. Everyone stay calm, she said, her voice steady despite the growing unease. It's probably just... The explanation never came. A massive, fur-covered form materialized near the back of the room, its golden eyes gleaming with predatory focus. A collective scream erupted as the bear let out a thunderous roar, its bulk towering over the desks. Students scrambled, chairs and desks toppling as they tried to put distance between themselves and the creature. The teacher stepped forward instinctively, her arms raised. Stay together, don't panic, she shouted over the chaos. The bear took a step forward, its claws scraping against the linoleum floor. The hum in the air intensified, and the equation on the chalkboard seemed to shift, its symbols warping subtly. More growls followed, and the impossible happened again. Another bear appeared, and then another. The creatures prowled between the desks, their sheer size and presence dominating the small classroom. The teacher stood frozen, her gaze locked on the bears as they circled the room. The students huddled together in corners, their fear palpable. And on the chalkboard, the equation seemed alive now, its symbols twisting and warping as though mocking the chaos it had unleashed. The growls of the bears filled the room, a low, guttural symphony that drowned out the sobs of the fear-stricken students. Their eyes gleamed as they prowled between overturned desks and shattered chairs. The teacher pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving as she struggled to maintain composure. But the chaos unfolding before her made even basic thought impossible. As if on cue, the school's alarm system blared, its shrill tone cutting through the cacophony. Red emergency lights strobed in the hallways, casting long, jagged shadows that writhed and twisted with every pulse. Outside, emergency vehicles screeched to a halt, their lights flashing in frantic bursts. Police officers and firefighters poured onto the school grounds, their commands barely audible over the rising panic of onlookers. Among them, a heavily armed SWAT team emerged, clad in black armor and carrying rifles drawn. What's the situation? One officer barked into his radio.
We've got multiple reports of animals, possibly bears, inside the building,
came the static-laden reply. Inside, the reality was far more horrifying than any of them could imagine. The teacher clutched her desk for support as the bears stalked closer. Just as she opened her mouth to plead to anyone, anything, a muffled whimper came from the far corner of the room, drawing her gaze. One of the students was trembling violently, their body jerking as though caught in an invisible grip. Their skin flushed crimson, veins bulging unnaturally. The teacher took a hesitant step forward, reaching out instinctively. Are you... The words died in her throat as the child's body twisted with an audible crack, their features distorting grotesquely. Fur erupted from their skin as their frame expanded into a hulking, bestial form. No! The teacher screamed, stumbling back. But it was already too late. The transformed child, a bear now, released an earth-shaking roar and lunged at the nearest cluster of students. Chaos erupted anew as desks shattered and screams turned to wails of agony. One by one, other children began to convulse, their cries blending with the monstrous growls as they too succumbed to the transformation. Fur replaced flesh, bones cracked and reformed, and human voices gave way to feral roars. The remaining students were no match for the onslaught. The newly transformed bears tore through the classroom, their claws mauling flesh and their jaws snapping through bone. Blood sprayed across the walls, pooling beneath shattered desks and trampled books. The teacher could only watch in frozen horror as the room descended into a scene of unspeakable carnage. By the time the growls subsided, silence reigned once more, broken only by the faint, metallic buzz of the classroom's fluorescent lights. She stood alone, trembling, surrounded by the bears that had once been her students. Their golden eyes glinted in the dim light, their massive bodies shifting as they turned their focus toward her. Her legs buckled beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing, her chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths. The largest bear moved forward, each thundering step echoing across the classroom floor. Its sheer presence was suffocating. Its eyes locked onto her with a predatory intensity that froze her in place. The teacher's body quivered, her mind racing, her lips parted, mouthing silent prayers. The bear raised a massive paw, claws glinting with the red of its most recent victims, and took another step closer. Suddenly, a deafening gunshot ripped through the air, shattering the eerie stillness. The classroom window exploded inward, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. The bear's massive frame shuddered as the bullet tore into its flank, crimson streaking its fur as the bullet struck deep. It whirled toward the source of the attack, its eyes blazing with fury. With a savage roar, it launched itself through the shattered window, landing heavily on the grass outside. The crowd of onlookers scattered, screams piercing the air as the enraged bear thundered toward them. Emergency personnel scrambled to respond as the SWAT team opened fire in a desperate attempt to subdue the creature. The bear was relentless. It tore through the first officer it encountered, swiping with claws that shredded armor and flesh alike. The other bears followed suit, leaping from the school's broken windows to join the carnage. The school's parking lot was filled with gunfire, screams, and the unrelenting roars of the bears as they ravaged everything in their path. It was only a matter of hours before the situation drew the attention of the SCP Foundation. Black vans with tinted windows rolled onto the school grounds. As the vehicles came to a stop, the sound of synchronized doors opening echoed like the prelude to a military operation. Agents in tactical gear emerged, their movements precise and deliberate. Black-clad and heavily armed, they carried an aura of unyielding authority. Without a word, they fanned out, securing the perimeter with practiced efficiency. A handful of agents approached the shattered school entrance, their footsteps crunching over broken glass and splintered wood. Survivors, shell-shocked students, and trembling faculty were quickly ushered into waiting vehicles. The agents spoke in low, calming tones, their reassurances almost robotic. Most of the evacuees wore blank expressions, too traumatized to resist, their eyes glazed as they stumbled toward safety. The gathered crowd of growing onlookers was less cooperative. Fearful whispers rippled through them, speculation and panic feeding into each other. A woman demanded answers from an agent.
"What's happening? Are my kids safe? Tell me what's going on."
The agent offered a neutral smile, his tone disarming but firm.
Everything is under control, Mom. Please return to your home.
She hesitated, her eyes darting to the shattered windows of the school. The agent leaned closer, whispering something she wouldn't remember moments later, as a small spray of mist dissipated between them. She blinked, confused, before quietly turning away, her panic replaced with a vague sense of forgetfulness. One by one, witnesses were intercepted and their memories selectively altered with Class B amnestics. By nightfall, the crowd had dispersed entirely. The schoolyard, once a scene of horror and carnage, was now quiet, save for the occasional murmur of Foundation personnel. Those who left carried no recollection of the events, only an unshakable sense of unease they couldn't explain. The once chaotic classroom had been transformed into a sterile examination site. Bright floodlights illuminated every corner, their harsh beams casting long, ominous shadows. The walls, still streaked with blood, bore silent testimony to the carnage that had unfolded just hours earlier. In the center of the room, the chalkboard remained untouched, The equation scrawled across its surface unassuming at first glance. Yet, as moments stretched, the air around it seemed to ripple faintly, charged with a tension that pressed against the walls. The symbols, motionless yet alive with hidden intent, seemed to hum with an inaudible vibration, like the lingering resonance of a struck tuning fork. Metal tables were brought in, each one meticulously organized with containment bags. Textbooks, retrieved from the wreckage, were stacked neatly, their covers pristine despite the devastation. One researcher stood over a textbook, gloved hands trembling slightly as they flipped to page 13. The equation stared back at them, its intricate loops and patterns both static and impossibly alive.
It's just numbers,
the researcher murmured, their voice barely above a whisper, tinged with disbelief. They stared down at the swirling equation on the page.
How does it do this?
Across the room, an agent standing guard near the doorway shifted, his sharp gaze fixed on the researcher.
It's not just numbers,
he said grimly, his voice cutting through the hum that had begun to rise again, faint but insistent.
Not anymore.
The vibration in the air grew stronger, no longer subtle, but a low pulse that echoed within their bones. Everyone froze, their breaths catching as the sensation spread. The agent by the door, his face impassive moments ago, suddenly winced. His hand shot up to his temple, fingers digging into the side of his head, as if trying to block out an invisible force.
You all right?
The researcher asked, their voice tight with concern. The agent didn't respond. His breathing grew ragged, his body trembling violently.
Something's wrong,
he choked out, his voice strained. Before anyone could react, he doubled over, a guttural groan tearing from his throat. His skin flushed, veins bulging grotesquely across his neck and arms. His uniform strained against his rapidly expanding frame as his body contorted, bones cracking audibly.
Get back!
The lead agent barked, shoving the nearest personnel toward the far wall. The transformation was swift and horrifying. Fur erupted from the agent's skin in patches, spreading in uneven bursts until his entire body was covered in a thick, matted coat. His face elongated into a snarling snout, golden eyes gleaming. In moments, the man was gone, replaced by an enormous bear that roared with an earth-shaking fury. Chaos erupted. The bear lunged forward, swiping a massive paw at the nearest agent. The impact sent the victim sprawling, their body colliding with a metal table before crumpling to the floor in a lifeless heap. Blood splattered across the sterile room, stark against the clinical white floodlights.
Take it down!
The lead agent shouted, his voice cutting through the screams. The remaining agents opened fire, their weapons cracking loudly in the confined space. Bullets tore through the air, striking the bear's thick hide, but the creature didn't falter. It charged forward, its jaws clamping shut around another agent's arm, ripping through flesh and bone with sickening ease. The researcher pressed against the wall, their heart pounding as they watched the destruction unfold. The hum from the equation seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as though feeding on the chaos. The lead agent didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, aiming directly for the bear's head. A single, thunderous shot rang out, the bullet striking true. The bear staggered, its roar faltering as it collapsed to the floor with a crash. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the labored breathing of the surviving agents. Blood pooled around the lifeless bear, its golden eyes staring blankly at the ceiling.
Everyone regroup,
the lead agent commanded, his voice tight but steady.
Get the injured out of here. Secure the materials now.
The Foundation personnel worked quickly to secure the materials, but by the next day, reports of similar incidents had spread across the region and beyond. Schools as far away as Scotland and Wales described identical scenes, classrooms overtaken by bears, students and teachers fleeing in terror, and equations that seemed to twist reality itself. Foundation operatives tirelessly fought to locate and retrieve every distributed copy of the textbook, but it was clear the anomaly had already spiraled out of control. Each confiscated book was transported to containment sites for further study, though the risk of interaction made progress slow. Meanwhile, the Foundation's top mathematicians and memetic specialists gathered in a sterile, high-security research lab deep within one of the Foundation's containment sites. The room hummed with tension, illuminated by the cold glare of fluorescent lights. On a large screen, The equation was displayed in painstaking detail, its looping, intricate symbols projected in high resolution. The researchers leaned over their terminals, their brows furrowed in concentration. Notes were scrawled on whiteboards, their surfaces filled with calculations and fragmented theories. Despite their best efforts, no coherent explanation for the anomaly emerged.
Doesn't make sense,
one mathematician muttered, running a hand through their disheveled hair.
the arrangement of these symbols. It's as if they're moving between dimensions we can't even perceive.
Another researcher, their face pale and drawn, tapped at their keyboard with trembling fingers.
These patterns suggest, no, they demand, a logic that simply shouldn't exist. It's like they're rewriting the rules of math itself.
The head of the team, a seasoned mimeticist, rubbed their temples and sighed heavily.
We're dealing with something far beyond human comprehension. Every time we try to make sense of it, it feels like it's looking back at us.
A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, but it quickly died as the lights flickered.
Did anyone else feel that?
One of the mathematicians asked, glancing around nervously. Before anyone could answer, a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but quickly grew into a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to rattle the very walls. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as an oppressive weight settled over the room. The symbols on the screen began to shimmer, their static forms twisted and writhed as though they were alive, pulsing with a sinister energy.
Oh God,
someone whispered, their voice barely audible. The first scream came from a mathematician seated near the front of the room. They clutched their chest, their breathing erratic as their skin flushed crimson. Their body convulsed violently, muscles tearing and bones snapping as fur burst forth from their skin.
Get back!
The mimeticist shouted, but it was too late. The transformation was rapid and horrifying. In moments, the mathematician was gone, replaced by a hulking bear whose roar shook the lab. Panic erupted. Researchers scrambled for the exits, knocking over chairs and equipment in their desperate attempt to escape. But the bear was not alone. All around the room, others began to convulse, their bodies contorting into grotesque, beastly forms. The remaining staff had no chance. The bears, now fully formed, turned on them with savage efficiency. Desks and monitors were smashed as claws and teeth tore through flesh and bone. Blood sprayed across the walls, staining the whiteboards and pooling beneath shattered glass. Some didn't transform themselves, but instead witnessed bears materializing from the shadows, emerging as if summoned by the equation's malignant influence. These bears wasted no time, their predatory instincts driving them to maul the researchers in frenzied attacks. Screams filled the lab, echoing through the corridors beyond, but they were short-lived. Within moments, the room fell silent, save for the low growls of the bears and the faint, persistent hum emanating from the screen. When security personnel finally breached the lab, they were met with a scene of devastation. Broken bodies lay strewn across the room, surrounded by the remnants of overturned desks and shattered equipment. The bears, now eerily calm, turned their eyes toward the intruders before vanishing into thin air, leaving the lingering hum in their wake. The head of the containment team stared at the screen where the equation remained, its symbols still shimmering faintly.
Seal every trace of it,
they said hoarsely. This anomaly came to be known as SCP-1313. Classified as Keter with a threat level of orange, it is an anomalous mathematical equation that, when solved, manifests a tangible adult female grizzly bear, Ursus arctos. The equation itself adheres to standard mathematical principles, but uniquely produces a physical bear instead of a numerical value, requiring only that the solver fully completes it, whether written or mentally calculated. First discovered following a bizarre bear attack at Whitecross Secondary School in Hereford, England, SCP-1313 has since been linked to over 1,724 incidents globally. These attacks have resulted in more than 1,600 fatalities and 900 injuries, with at least 20% of manifested bears or their unstable derivatives still unaccounted for. SCP-1313's derivative equations yield even stranger results, such as square roots of bears or bear multiplications, which briefly produce horrific, poorly integrated entities that wreak havoc before their inevitable collapse. The Foundation's containment efforts include monitoring schools for bear attacks, deploying Mobile Task Force Delta 10, Answer Key, to neutralize threats, and erasing civilian knowledge with amnestics. Personnel are strictly prohibited from solving the equation, as even partial comprehension risks catastrophic manifestations. Excess bears are either released, repurposed for Foundation needs, or quietly disposed of. Ultimately, SCP-1313 defies explanation and containment in equal measure. Perhaps the most fitting lesson here isn't mathematical, but philosophical. Some problems really do have unbearable solutions.